So Business of APIs conference, we started it back in, I think, 2007. We were looking for a conference to sponsor. And there was this thing called Web 2.0, and that was sort of very broad. And then there were sort of the early versions of hackathons. There were, they called it Mashup Camp. And all the camps were all the rage then. And there was really nothing in between to talk about how this was going to transform a business. But we had started Mashery because the business that I was involved in at the time, a small search engine company, needed APIs to survive and to thrive. And without them, without a proper API, the business was not going to go anywhere. And so when I realized that there was really no way for the business to go anywhere, I went to our board of directors at this other company and said, look, absent APIs, which we are too small to build, we have a real problem, and as a biz dev guy, I can't really dev any biz. So I had to leave, right? And so I went and had dinner with one of our investors, and we started talking about APIs, and this was 2006. And this early stage investor decided that every company he was investing in was going to need APIs, so why doesn't he just write me a check to build them once for everybody in his organization, in his portfolio? And so that was the beginning of Mashery. We went and we built API infrastructure. But a funny thing happened along the way. We had thought we were building this for all of Josh's little startup companies he was investing in. And it turned out that we actually didn't sell to any of them for about 4 years. It took 4 years to get our first customer out of Josh's portfolio, which ostensibly was why we were building this company in the first place. Because what happened along the way, one was the thing about startups, which is that startup CTOs never buy anything that they think they can build themselves, which was actually a bad thing for a company that was started with the intention of selling to startups, which I don't recommend, as it turns out. But then a really good thing happened, and it was this freight train called mobile came through. And so shortly after we started Mashery, the iPhone was released. So there was no iPhone when we started. There were rumors of it, but the iPhone hadn't come out yet. And of course, those of you who had the first iPhone may remember that the iPhone only had 10 icons on the screen, and there were no other apps. There was no app store. There was no second page, right? The second page didn't exist. And then along the way came the first ability to have open apps. Many of us jailbroke our iPhone because we wanted to get there sooner. And this demand, this requirement that we start doing more with the iPhone than just the 10 apps we got, which were actually pretty cool to be able to do those things. That was pretty good. So then the iPhone happened, the Android operating system came out, the iPad happened. And Android was interesting, got started fairly slowly, but the iPad changed everything, because in the iPad, we suddenly had a bigger screen, right? And with that, people instantly realized that their mobile app, which really was their iPhone app because it was the only kind of mobile app there was a really lousy experience on the iPad. You couldn't get there, and you couldn't, you just enlarged it, and suddenly you had a large-looking app, but you weren't really taking advantage of context, of the difference in use. Why do you have a tablet versus a phone? You use them in different ways. And so people started understanding that context mattered, location mattered, the difference between mobile and portable mattered, and with that became this lovely evolution toward an app strategy, where you weren't going to have one app for a company or a division or a product, but multiple apps. And a great app, as we like to say here, a great app grants a wish. You are in a particular time, a particular place, a particular concept, and that app allows you to perform something very simple, get it done, and move on. So with this lovely freight train called mobile that came through, this established Mashery as a necessary set of infrastructure, not for these small companies who we thought we were going to be selling to, but for some really, really big companies in some really big industries. Because they all looked around and they said, we need an app strategy. These apps have to talk to something to be useful. How does that happen? And they started coming to events like this and learning how to spell API, and they thought that looked pretty cool. And the good news for us as a small company was they had lots of money, and were willing to part with it. The bad news was they expected us to be a fairly professional enterprise-grade company with things like SLAs and service and all that kind of nonsense. And so we had to go build all that, and it made us a better company. It made it a better product, and along the way, it helped to build this new ecosystem. That served us pretty well for 3 or 4 more years, and we found that in each year, a new sector started to glom onto this API thing. So it started off fairly early with people who were in the business of selling data anyway. Your data seller people, your comm scores, your people who are in the business of data. Very quickly, e-commerce came in because people who wanted to sell things realized that they wanted to sell things in a mobile strategy, in a portable strategy. So you had people in the US like Best Buy and coming on board. Over here, Tesco is a very early leader in the world of APIs. They figured out all kinds of great stuff there. And then you had the media come along, right? New York Times was a very early one in the US. Over here, The Guardian was way ahead of everybody in terms of doing APIs and figuring out in a business that was being totally disrupted by being disrupted by mobile and by the phone in general and by the internet. How could you evolve that business into something that can continue to make money? And The Guardian was very early on that. And then we started seeing travel coming on board, right? Travel is sort of an extension of e-commerce, but Sabre, Expedia, British Airways, a lot of these great companies are figuring this stuff out. And so that sort of took us along until a couple years ago when Intel bought Mashery. And what was that all about, right? Suddenly there's this chip company. And I got all these questions. Why would Intel buy Mashery? I guess people thought it would be a different company. But Intel has been at the center of computing for a very long time. Most computing happened pre-mobile on Intel devices. And then mobile happened, and that didn't go as well for Intel. And so if you look at what is coming next, in the business of APIs, in the business of the internet, it's these connected devices. It's the Internet of Things. And whether we like it or not, and by the way, we do like it, this world of ours is now, we could be calling this the Business of IoT conference. I think we'll be pretty much to lunchtime before our first web company even comes and talks. And it's, a lot of the focus here is on seeing what happens in this world. And we'll hear from Tom here, who is our IoT guru at Intel. Joe Burton was at Cisco dealing with pre-connected device things there when Cisco invested in Mashery, and I think you're pretty much all in on IoT at this point. And so it's been a really interesting thing, and what we found with this business of APIs and why it's fun to be here today and listen to all this great information is IoT is the next freight train, right? It's this thing that is coming through. And just as at Mashery, we were very fortunate that, that the mobile thing happened when we really needed it to. At Intel, Intel's a really big place. And the left hand at Intel doesn't always know what the right hand is doing when there are 107,000 people working there. But what was really great to see when we showed up on our first day at Intel, we looked around and saw all these cool things happening, and there's stuff all over the world happening at Intel. But one of the things that we really started to get interested in was this whole world of the Internet of Things. And Maribel mentioned the large number of billions, 20, 50, pick your number, connected devices. Well, if there's going to be that many connected devices, there's got to be fabs churning those things out. And turns out Intel has a lot of them, and they have a lot of capacity, and we're really good at doing that. And so if these connected devices are going to connect to anything, they need to connect through APIs. That's sort of how it works. And so it very quickly became obvious why it made sense for Intel to be in the API business, for Intel to be in the connectivity business, because back when the Intel chips were mostly used in servers and desktop machines, Intel was in the connectivity software business doing things like writing drivers and making sure the firmware worked. That's what connectivity was for an Intel chip back then. Well, now, when Intel chips are going to go in everything, connectivity is connecting to the internet. Connectivity is literally bolting the cloud onto any connected device you have. So with this freight train that we've now had, what's next? Right? We're going to learn a lot about how devices connect with each other, but I wanted to leave you with something I noticed a couple weeks ago, actually it was just last week, that is happening in the world of Twitter. So Twitter had a big conference last week called Flight, and it was their second major developer conference. The first one was about 4 or 5 years ago, where they embraced developers and then sort of pissed them all off, right? That was what Twitter did really well. They claim, so this conference last week in San Francisco was Twitter's attempt to reintroduce themselves to the developer community. And they provided a lot of really wonderful salty snacks for the developers, right? Really, really wonderful things that developers will love. And I looked at what they were offering, and it seems like it's taking us in a really interesting direction. So the obvious salty snacks, and there were a bunch of them, but 3 of them stood out. One is this thing called Digits, which is this great means of authenticating devices through SMS. Twitter is really, really big on SMS, and it's a very, very simple thing to accomplish. Already available supposedly in 215 countries, I think they said, which is interesting. I think the UN recognizes 190 countries, so Twitter is bigger than the world, right? They provide this thing called Crashlytics, which hopefully will make our mobile apps suck less, right? By helping developers understand when crash is going to happen. And they provided a new advertising monetization platform called MoPub. And these all got a lot of press, but the one that people weren't really looking at very much, that I think is actually the biggest thing happening, is actually a new API for Twitter itself. And this API does a few things really, really well. First of all, it is the gold standard for SDKs out there. So if any of you are going to build a developer experience, and whoever's building your SDK, whoever's building your developer experience, go have them install this new Twitter system. That it is, all my developer friends are like, I wish every SDK was like that. So that's great, right? But Twitter calls this set of services, they call it Fabric, okay? It's all these new services. And I think they did that on purpose, because they really are, with this API, they're creating a new fabric for connected devices and the connected internet. And what Fabric does, what the API does, is it makes it super, super simple for developers and for devices to communicate through Twitter with other devices and with the internet at large. It is essentially a global asynchronous network. And we all think of tweets as, this celebrity tweeting at that celebrity and this sports star and, politics and Tiananmen Square or the Arab Spring or whatever it is. Right? We think of Twitter as human-readable texts, messages that we all can look at. But with this new fabric, I believe Twitter will become as big again as a means of devices communicating with each other. You can take any device out there, create machine-readable messages that Twitter will deliver asynchronously anywhere on the planet, and allow you to build a fabric of connectivity without actually building any of that back end yourself, right? That is going to be the interesting part of Fabric, and that's going to be, I believe, a really important part of what anybody in the world of connected devices is going to be building over the next few years. So I encourage you to check that out. Not a lot is being written about the back-end version of this, but it's coming, and I encourage you all to see it. So with that, I'd like to also welcome you to the Business of APIs, the Business of IoT conference, and turn it back over to Maribel. Thank you.